there's no greater superpower than being vulnerable and secure at the same time. And
That
that
is
takes
very
insight.
true. That's
Yeah.
true. That takes insight and it takes courage. And I think what we're talking about is waking people up so that they stop living their lives on autopilot.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to i2eYe, where we discuss reframing the conversation. My name is Matt.
And I'm Lana.
Welcome. So let's just jump right into it. We want to talk about perspective and how we can learn to measure it differently.
Okay, so I just watched the intro video that you designed where you actually created a physical scale to measure abstract concepts, which I find very interesting. And I'm wondering how you figured out to do that, because that's it's so interesting, because it's like I don't come from a science or math background, so I can think about abstract concepts, but when you're actually measuring them in a tangible way, that is what's blowing my mind.
Yeah, I have a very interesting background, and we'll get more into that later. It's a lot of physics and computers and programming and such. But what I think is most important is taking that whole aspect of my past out, except for realizing that that's kind of what led me to this comfort zone to explore my own kind of understanding of how things work. Now, what I've done is, yeah, I've decided to reframe a lot of concepts that I've heard my whole life. And I find there is a lot of talk about everybody having a perspective, everybody having a point of view, everybody having a mindset, an objective. Everybody's got their own self-interest in this world. And what I've decided is, I said, okay, I'm going to take all these concepts and I'm going to reimagine everything. And one of the keywords I hit on a lot is self-discovery and everybody's own path. And so understanding that it's not about the path that got you to a point of wanting to reassess things and reevaluate. Like, everybody can use their own path to reevaluate the pressures they felt throughout their life. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to reevaluate the pressures that I felt growing up and come up with more of an understanding of why I felt that way. And maybe that was COVID, maybe that was politics and everything that's going on in the world. But I started to look at the world and think, is this all there is? And it wasn't making me feel good. And it wasn't making me proud as I used to be, as everybody was telling me, you got to be proud about this, you got to be proud about that, and you got to be proud about that. And if I wasn't, then I was, I was inconsiderate, or I didn't appreciate things. So what I decided to do was take everything that I was told and just say, I'm going to put it all to the side here. And I'm going to reimagine the way that I see the world. And so what I did was I said, okay, let's take that concept of everybody having their own perspectives, their own mindsets, their own opinions, and put that all as one concept called a point of view. And I put that down here. And what I said is, okay, what is going to be opposite of that? What everybody having a different point of view is a commonality. And so I said, okay, all of our differences go down here, all of our differences, all of our similarities can go up here. And then I said, okay, now how am I going to know what's the difference between what we have all in common and what we have that are similar? And well, that's where I decided it is. And again, it's for me. Everybody can come up with their own kind of concepts, their own kind of measurement and scale device. What I started thinking is, okay, why don't we use common sense as a point of view? Everybody's got a different interpretation of common sense, and it's most often used as a way to make themselves feel better and make themselves feel more comfortable. So that grounded a lot of concepts and a lot of things that I was told and pursuits that I realized only made me feel a little bit better about myself, but never actually did. And so the more I realized, if I take out what we believe is common sense from this greater understanding, then I don't fall to those same trappings as all the people 100 years ago, 50 years ago, now, and what will happen in 20 years when everybody says the world has changed. So I think, well, is the world changed, or were your self-interest grounded in what was best for you and not best for everybody? And so these are the kind of thoughts that were kind of rolling around. And what this video of physics of perspective is, what I found through my own experience, what I was told is important, all fell onto the lower half of the scale. When I realized the things that I'm most proud of, that make me most empathetic and most proud of myself, those things that give me these positive impulses, those things I realized were in many ways immeasurable. And so I put those things that we find immeasurable above the scale. And the more I did, the more I started to be able to compartmentalize the things between what other people do to make themselves feel better and what I find thinking about and valuing makes me feel better. And it allowed me to reevaluate things, not because other people find them valuable that I should, but whether those things were valuable to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that you say how values change over time. So it's like if common sense changing over time, because common sense, you're right, is very subjective, because like common knowledge is just what we've agreed upon as a society. So I'm wondering, how do we get to that greater understanding, that objective perspective? Because we have so many varying circumstances, and that subjective point of view is going to be full of tiny variables and nuances with everyone's experience. How do we as a collective reach that objective, these are the facts, take your self-interest out of it?
Well, I think part of that is when I speak about like reimagining the conversation or reevaluating the conversation, I think that's part of learning to reframe the conversation before you're having it. And that is, so when I have conversations, when I'm talking to people, I notice that what they're telling me are all things that are subjectively in their best interest or to make themselves feel better. It's always about their accomplishments. It's about their stories. It's about their career. They care about how attractive they are. It's all about money and economy, and it's their place within this certain kind of system, as opposed to being able to take themselves outside of that box and seeing the system for what it is. And that's where it takes imagination and vulnerability. It's nothing to see the picture, but it's a whole other thing to separate yourself from that and then have a conversation about the picture. And so that's where we get the perspective is a greater depth than just the point of view of what's best for me, seeing it's what's best. Because most people will defend whatever makes them feel most comfortable in this world, and realizing that what makes one person more comfortable just makes someone else less comfortable. It is a tug of war between subjective points of view. But if we can look at the world through an objective perspective, we will see our differences as things that we can relate to each other better. So the more I kind of explore my own insecurities and how that led me down that path that I took, and what I pursued, how my dreams changed from when I was a child to a teenager to an early adult, I found my dreams were more influenced by my insecurities than they were out of my own pursuit of an objective that I got to choose, that I felt was right for me. And so what do you do if everybody tells you this is what you have to do with your life before you're ever able to figure out what you want to do with it? And we just get lost in that pursuit of chasing those things. And we're always looking for the go ahead to, okay, now I can change my life. Well, I think allowing people to explore a deeper insight into who we are as living creatures is not something that's crazy. I think it's crazy not to.
Yeah, I agree. And what I find interesting is that you're talking about almost an internal battle of like, this is what society is telling you to be, but is this really what I want? I'm wondering how we can apply this system of measurement to somebody who is in a particular circumstance where they don't really have a lot of options to self-reflect and think about, who they really want to be. Like, what if they're in a financially dire position where like they have to be working a job and providing for a family, having to go through the rat race of this very capitalist society that we live in? How can we apply that to those people who are in a more restricted circumstance?
I think no matter how busy you are, there's always an opportunity at any moment for self-reflection. And I think it's what we choose to do in the moments where we're not committed to sustainability. We have to sustain our life and our physical security and our wellness, our body and the people around us and our responsibilities. But then there is so much other time then. And I think that's where all the entertainment and the overstimulation and the phones and all of that stuff is just a way to distract people from their ability to reflect, because that self-reflection can often be a scary thing for a lot of people, especially when they realize that those commitments that they've made and responsibilities that they've taken on that are now kind of drowning them in that pressure. They were pressured to get into those situations to begin with. And so by using pressure as an excuse to not evaluate pressure is just ignoring pressure, which will create more pressure, and that'll never go away. Nothing changes. And I guess other than their own self-reflection, I think the best thing that anyone in those positions can do, rather than feeling like there's no opportunity, is to express their honest vulnerabilities where they are now, where things are so heavy they don't know where to turn, as opposed to pretending like they have all the answers and things aren't so bad. If they shared how they honestly felt, more people would say, hey, I feel that way too. Mm-hmm. They would feel less alone. And I think if they were more vocal about not having the answers, let's say parents who are trapped in in those responsibilities of raising a family, maybe like just being honest with the children, being like, you know what, I don't have all the answers and I'm really sad. Maybe the children can then have an opportunity to reevaluate whether they should follow in their parents' footsteps. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of depressed parents that told their kids to follow along in their footsteps for their own self-interest. And now they're down so far down a certain path that they feel inside that they were wrong, and maybe the world and their influences might not have been right. Maybe they're grounded in a common sense that no longer applies. And are they still living by that kind of morality and principles and values? Mm-hmm. So reevaluating those things is what I find is what I believe is self-reflection. Sorry.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think vulnerability goes a long way. And if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that like we're really not paying a lot of attention to what our values are, or maybe we were placing our values in the wrong thing, because this entire experience has forced everyone to self-reflect to some degree. And so it'll be interesting to see how people's values change. But it's like when we're talking about a scale of measurement, I'm still skeptical of everyone being able to take self-interest out of it. Like, how do you remove yourself from that so that you can just look at the objective perspective and just look at things as they are? Because we're so conditioned and ingrained in this structure. It's like we're so attached to our identities and the things that we think shape our identities. It's a big move.
Well, okay. I think a way to look at it is, what kind of value are we getting for continuing on this trajectory, or what kind of value are we getting for using our minds the way that we do? And so where I say there is a different kind of value that we can achieve and we can feel that is in our best interest, is in our best self-interest, that is greater than the pursuits we're after now. And so what I've realized is the more that we can use our imagination and apply it to make our lives better, the more that and to change our lives in ways we never thought, that is basically what I believe is the definition of evolution and our conscious evolution. And so the positive impulses that I feel and I can create while using my imagination throughout the day of how things can look differently and how things can be differently and why things are the way they are, you burn calories at a way faster rate. You create these electrical signals and these electrical impulses as you start to see the world more clearly, and the fog starts to go away. And that's something that no pills, no vaccines, none of that stuff can deliver. And all these other cultures have described this certain mindset and these certain stories and archetypes and these people and these principles and these prophets of these people that said, hey, if you believe in this one thing, you're going to get this massive reward. And all over the world, throughout all of history, different cultures that were completely removed said, hey, if you look at things a certain way, or if this certain person brought light to our society and changed who we are, and it changed the course of their entire civilization. And when you start to realize that maybe it's not one thing, maybe it is a misunderstanding of one thing, then you can see all these other things as kind of like fragments. And so that take your self-interest out, I think, is just one way to frame this as this is your subjective point of view, but understanding that your objective perspective is in your best self-interest. It's just hard to see at the moment. And so that's where taking your time and space out of it matters more, because it's not about what that food tastes like as much as it's about how's that food going to make me feel in half an hour and an hour later. The more people choose what's going to make them feel better in the long run, the better their choices are going to be in the short term. And that's where having those positive impulses versus negative impulses and understanding the difference between the two.
Sorry, could you say that?
Any negative impulse will feel good in the moment, but long term, those negative impulses make us feel so worse and will drag us down. And if we can recognize the difference between positive and negative impulses in our own minds, in our own chemistry, we realize that maybe those negative impulses were seemed more positive because that's all other people valued before.
Yeah. So like how do we differentiate between those two? Because I think there is a fine line between self-interest and then looking at, a positive impact, because like those, it's very easy to fall into self-interest.
Right.
When you're making those changes, because like, if you start eating healthier, you're going to start feeling better, you're going to start looking better, and it's going to that's going to like hit you right in the ego right off the bat.
So that's where, perfect example. So where everyone else might believe that first you eat better, then you'll feel better. I believe it comes first from a sense of feeling better, then you will eat better. So it's not about exercising to be healthier. It's about feeling better first and then realizing that you want to exercise. Okay. And then it is an increase. So it's about understanding why. Why do we exercise? If you exercise so that you look more attractive, that's subjective, because you looking attractive doesn't help anybody. But having more energy and getting out of bed excited, that makes you a better friend, parent, sibling, all of it. If you can get out of bed and feel a little bit better about yourself every single day, and it's not from actually feeling better about yourself, it's about changing the trajectory of your life. The more you can take control of the trajectory of your life, the better you will feel about your life, rather than making the best out of the trajectory that you feel like you were forced upon.
So it's almost like everyone's taking care of their own part of this global machine, this organism that we're all a part of. Like if we're all, if I take care of me and you take care of you, together we'll both be at our full capability to do better for the world. Yeah. Is that kind of what you mean?
Exactly. And there's so many analogies to use. That's where it takes a long time to boil down and to figure out. But it's understanding that everybody learns the same mindset, and it is this: what is best for me first will make me feel the best. And it's just how we apply that, how we learn to rationalize it. that's where I think the wrong trajectory is. So it's people learning, okay, this is the answer I want to come up with, and then backtracking to get to that answer, as opposed to the other way around, where you think, okay, I'm just going to take that thought process this way and see where I arrive. And so the more we learn to do that, that's taking ourselves out of it and seeing it for the bigger picture. So it's hard to communicate that, because we found everybody seems to find these different comfort zones and these echo chambers where people see the world the way I do, and then they lean into those directions. And those people will convince each other that they're right leaning into those directions because they feel these impulses in doing so. They don't know whether it's positive or negative. They just know that it feels positive for them. And so if we're all leaning in different directions into smaller and smaller comfort zones, that will cause us to relate to each other less and less. And the more we're unfamiliar with each other and the more we feel like we can't relate, the more we see each other as different. And so by realizing that we need to do the exact opposite of that and find how we can relate to each other more, that is realizing that with that measurement and that scale, I can relate to people who have imagination. I can relate to people who have vulnerabilities, to compassion, to honesty, to values. And I understand what it took for me to get to that space and that kind of mindset. And I know where I used to be when I didn't and how I used to feel. And so I don't just relate to people who see the world the way I do today. I relate to people who see the world the way I used to and see themselves how I used to. And when I think about who I relate now to the people who other people didn't understand, but who express themselves in ways that still echo today. And so you got people like Da Vinci, you got people, Monet, you got like not just the artists, but the poets and all these people that said, I see the world differently. And the more I do, the more the world changes. That is evolving your perspective, or at least growing your insight. So how can we relate to each other better is by understanding there's a deeper level of insight that will help us relate to each other. And by going the opposite way, by showing how we don't and how we are different, the more we are different, the more we are the same. And it's realizing that we've been spreading out everybody in all these niches. And now that we got them all spread out, we realize that they are all part of one kind of thing. And that is us feeling insecure about ourselves. That's the smaller the box, the more insecure we feel. The deeper in those kind of those rooms we are, because we're getting more and more scared and the world's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the internet has just kind of helped that, right?
Yeah, you and I have discussed this before when it comes to compartmentalizing into smaller and smaller boxes and niches. And this is where we disagree a little bit, because I do think that going through those steps is necessary to really find yourself, because everyone's experience is so incredibly nuanced. And when like when you get into, I can't find the word there's a word floating in my head and I can't think of it, but like it's when you distill, that's what it is. When you distill into those smaller bits, you're finding people that connect with you about certain things and certain experiences that you're not going to relate with everyone. So I do think that it is important to go through that experience of finding out like, okay, this tiny little box, this is me, this is my experience. And then opening it back up to, this is why I interact with this group of people this way. This is why I, am like this in this particular environment. Because then when you look at it, like there's so many intricacies to being human and how we relate to each other. And our subjective experience is a huge part of that. So I think it is important to understand that before stepping back and looking at the bigger picture and saying, okay, but how are we all the same?
Yeah, I just don't think that is up to anyone to tell anybody else that they have to go that direction. Because the only reason I spent 3 decades searching desperately for the box that made me feel the most comfortable was because everybody else had a box. I thought.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't relate to anyone else's box. It just made me feel alone because I wanted there to be one box. I wanted everyone else to look at each other and go, we're all kind of amazing and the same. And I find the issue with the boxes are it's easy to put a value on those boxes and say their box isn't as valuable as my box. Their country isn't as valuable as my country.
Yeah.
Their hair color is more valuable than my. So all those differences, rather than finding the one that makes us feel most comfortable, I think we need to all acknowledge that these boxes only served our insecurities, never served the best interest of us as a whole. And so that is up to everybody on their own to choose. You know what? I'm gonna find a box that makes me feel more secure, or decide I'm going to find my security by removing all of the boxes.
Yeah.
And so I don't find pride in my skin color. I find pride that I don't define myself by my skin color. I don't take pride in my masculinity as much as I take pride in that I don't define myself by my masculinity. It doesn't matter about what my sexual orientation is as much as it matters that it is not my identity. It makes none of those things that are in that bottom half of that scale have anything to do with my identity, only the foundation of my perspective.
Yeah, I guess I'm also looking at it from the perspective of somebody who has been an outcast most of their life. So it's like finding those pockets of community to validate those insecurities has been really helpful in that sense of finding my identity. And like, you know, today I can look at all of those like tiny little things and step back from it and go, okay, but like none of those are going to dictate what I do next. They only dictate what I've done up until now. So I do think it's important to understand those things, but I see what you're saying because you're like jumping 10 steps ahead and saying like, forget all of this. Like, let's just throw the social structure out of the window and just look at each other as humans, which I think is beautiful. And it's a very wonderful view of the world. I guess I'm just skeptical because we do live in a very structured society that does like to divide and compartmentalize and place values on things, which is completely arbitrary. So yeah, I don't know.
But why does it do that?
I think like human nature, we just like to dissect things to understand them better and look for like, we're very big on pattern recognition.
Right. So this is just a way to dissect things differently. So instead of dissecting people from in the way that we've always done, it's dissecting our mindsets and our goals in a different way. So yeah, when we talk about human nature is a certain way and the world is a certain way, that is grounded in its own self-interest. The world doesn't want to change because it feels like it is in their self-interest not to. And so by taking that self-interest out, we can realize that in the best interest of the world and of every generation to come is by changing and evaluating that and evolving something better. And to do that, we need everything in the top of that scale. So that's where we need to focus more on imagination and vulnerabilities and compassion, the way that we relate to each other, rather than the boxes that we have learned to find comfort in. Those boxes are suffocating our society as opposed to sheltering us. I think that's part of not getting grounded in common sense and the way that the world is. It is pulling the world in a different direction, and we can only do that through an organic kind of enlightenment, and not in a religious sense, but simply in a let's all take a deep breath and look at where we were 5,000 years ago, where we are today, and where we could be tomorrow. And I don't want to be where I see our trajectory going. And that is out of an honesty and I just think, why were people 100, 200, and 300 years ago that decided how we're going to live our lives today? What makes them right? And the only people that think that the generations, 10 generations ago and more, and slavery and all of the mistreatment and dehumanization, the only people that look up to those people who acted in common sense are the people who benefit from it today. And every single person that says I'm looking at the world incorrectly now because I don't respect past generations the way they do, they tell me, yeah, but look at your self-interest. And I say, but that's not an answer for me. So yeah, but look at all the things you have today. I'm like, well, that's out of self-interest. Look at all the things that could be around today. Think about all the people who could be living much different lives. Because if 95% of the people admit that they're depressed and think the world's going down the wrong trajectory, why are we defending that trajectory? Why aren't we reevaluating that trajectory? And to me, that's creating a new box for new reasons. And it's not for my own comfort and self-interest. It is out of best interest in 100 years. Because I can think 100 years later, and think, thank fuck they reevaluated what they were doing. Because that's something that future generations can appreciate, not retelling the same stories that they've been telling that don't make any sense. And I was 5 years old knowing history didn't make any sense, but everyone around me told me it did. So that's that. Am I wrong or is the world wrong? I have a positive impulse not to believe everybody else, but they're telling me that that's actually a negative impulse. So now I wire my brain differently to see my imagination and free thoughts as a negative and believing everybody else as a positive. And so those are two impulses that feel good, but train your brain to recognize one and value one over the other. That's that scale, that balance, that karma, you know?
So like, it's like you're talking about going back to that childhood innocence where like your imagination just ran wild before society categorized you, before they gave you a gender, a role, this is what you need to do with your life. This is the education you need to have. Like you're talking about, just look at the world and take all of the pre-programming out of it. How would you like to look at the world?
Right. A concept I heard all the time, my whole life, was brainwashing. And it seems like a scary thing. I don't want to be brainwashed, realizing that, you know, we wash everything else. Why not wash our own brains? And so that's where I kind of said, I'm going to reset. And if my brain really is, you know, like this calculator, this muscle, this, you know, why not exercise it in the way that I decide, not in the way that other people told me how to use it. So if your brain is a tool and a measurement device and a compass and all these other things, why let other people determine where your north and south is and et cetera? So I'm like, okay, I'm just going to restart my own fucking compass. And I'm going to say, this is what I feel like matters more. And I was creating positive impulses. Ooh, that feels good. I'm heading the right direction. This one where it's just like, let's get drunk 4 nights in a row because we're sad and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Negative impulses. Tried it. It was fun at first, but I realized long-term, those are not positive impulses. Those are negative impulses, even though everyone around me was telling me that those are positives. So there we go. There's my new scale. And I'm gonna say, how then do I decide where all these fit on the scale? And that's where I had to discover another, or come up with my own kind of measurement to say where these are gonna fit to make this kind of box. And so that's where the immediate benefit comes, and then the long-term benefits. And I started to look at my own life, whether they were positive or positive benefits long-term or short-term, and realizing that the more I did that, the more I can dissect the world and my own mindset and reevaluate for myself what feels good and what doesn't and why. And I hear a lot of people telling me, Matt, this is what we're told is a good thing. And I realized, well, in 10 years and 20 years, you're going to tell me that it wasn't. And the excuse is, well, everybody else was doing it. How many excuses are that for other generations? Well, everybody else was doing it. I didn't know any better. I did what was best for me at the time. I did what was best for my family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's all subjective best.
Yeah.
It is not actual best. And so that's just a different way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
Sorry, rambling.
No. It's no. I like what you're saying. And I'm just, because I'm skeptical of human nature, obviously, because we have so much conflict in our society. And I'm wondering what happens when people's scales conflict. Like what happens when their positive thing conflicts with this person's positive thing.
Well, then
if we're trying to create a space that's, you know, benefiting everyone, how do we do that when we all have different needs? Because I'm not talking about
Well,
values, I'm talking about like physical needs.
right. And so I see that as, so taking different people is just taking different subjective points of view. And so that is that tug of war between, well, this person needs something more than this person needs something more than this person. But those are all just, okay, let's determine who needs something more, realizing that we're not solving the actual big picture, because that is simply survival. And so I feel like all we've done is focus on our own survival as opposed to actually thriving. So what I will do then is say, okay, well, what are these needs, and are they true insecurities, or are they just somebody's lack of insight? And so what's the difference? I say, okay, I don't care if 99% of the population have a certain point of view, but they have no concept of any deeper insight into that point of view, then I know that point of view is simply for their own self-interest. And so could that person who needs one thing look at that other person who needs something else and be able to put themselves into that point of view and be able to measure themselves the same way that other person does? So that's where everybody meeting in this one space and saying that these are the things that matter the most. And then realizing that that's what insight is about. Insight is about taking your own self-interest out. And so, like I said, everybody else can see the world one way, but if everybody's seeing it through their own self-interest, then none of them are right. And so it's the more we can evolve in learning to take our subjective point of view out of the equation, the more insight we will gain into that objective perspective. And and it's one of those things, you start to feel it. You start to feel it when you start to reimagine things and you start to look at your past differently. Your memories start to change and they start to look brighter. You stop seeing your memories through your own eyes, and you start to see your memories through a greater perspective. And you don't, it changes the way you see the world, and you can't fake it. And that's the thing, is it's hard to explain to somebody until they see it and they feel it. Whoa, that feels different. I never thought of that before. And the more someone's like, I never thought of that before, if it's something real, that thought will then apply to everything else. That is taking the hypocrisy and the subjectiveness out of it and realizing that the right answer applies to everyone and everything in nature, in physics, and that. And by saying, well, it only applies to human beings and not nature. It only applies to this color skin, but not this color skin. People who have been through this experience or haven't been through this experience. All of these things, I think, are ways that we go the wrong direction in our mindset. And as opposed to pushing people away because of their differences, I bring people in because of their differences.
I think you're right. Because you've said that we place too much value on certain identifiers, and that becomes too much of our identity, and we anchor ourselves to that rather than evolving. Like, I think you're right in that regard, and it does stagnate to a certain degree, but I do see value in sharing that subjective story, because the more we learn about each other and each other's experiences, the more empathy we can gain. So then when we're looking at this bigger picture, like let's say we're building a structure that we want everyone to have access to, you're going to have to think about accessibility and who needs what to get through the door, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and I can't, I never want to speak for anybody else, and everybody has their own pursuits and their own kind of holes inside that they're trying to fill with things. And I think instead of like what my goal would ideally for the world, how I would wish the world could have been, was instead of the world creating these holes that we have to fill ourselves, allowing people to never have those holes to begin with. Because even though I went through whether you want to call it popular or friends and social, I thrived socially for many years, but I never was happy in any of those social circles. And I've realized the people that are most happiest in those social circles are the ones that are actively pushing people out of them. And so that gives them a greater sense of comfort. So what I'm hoping to to express, and that I wish a lot more people would, from a vulnerable, honest place, those people that pushed other people out of those boxes, that caused them to go and find their own comfort zones. I wish all those people can then admit that those comfort zones that they push those people out of were never actually comfortable. And so it's not about finding which one fits you most. It's about realizing that no matter which one, everybody's uncomfortable in those boxes. And as far as you go to look for the box that is right, none of them are right. And I didn't realize it until it's one of those, if you can't beat them, join them. And then I joined them and I was like, not for me. And I went, so it didn't matter whether it was the kind of the more eccentric group, the athletes, the skaters, the musicians, it seemed like I was able to cross all these borders, and every single border would say different things about different people, but it was all the same kind of hypocrisy and insecurity. And the less we relate to people, the more we apply negative impulses to them. And so it creates this thing where hate feels good because all we have left are negative impulses. And the more we lean into those negative impulses, the less we recognize positive. And so maybe things feel good for every single human being right now, but that doesn't mean they're positive. An impulse feels good, but if we're all leaning towards our negative impulses, then those are not the right impulses to lean into. And by reevaluating what makes us feel good, we realize that it came from a place of feeling bad first.
Yeah, that's true, because pain is information.
Right. Like electricity, colors, smells, etc. Yeah.
So I'm thinking, because like what you just said was really interesting, and I'm trying to figure out how to articulate my thoughts.
Sorry, it took me like 20 minutes of circling just to get to that one point that made sense.
But you make such an interesting point, and it's making me think about the fact that you're right, because the more we divide, the more it's like, oh, I'm going to hate this group because it's not part of my group, and my group makes me feel safe. My group makes me feel like I'm a part of something. But I mean, then you have people like me who've never really fit into any particular group. Like I've always been like, I identify with this group a little bit, these people a little bit, but never fully in anything. Because like, I mean, for example, like my group of friends in high school was the misfits. Like it was all the weirdos that didn't fit in anywhere else. And even in that group, I still felt very much like an outsider because I didn't fit in. So it, in some ways, like, yeah, it does help you discover things about yourself. But I'm wondering, how do we get past that? Because we have been conditioned for our entire civilization to have these divisions. I mean, like the concept of borders in itself, they're just imaginary lines. It's all one big floating rock that we're sharing. So just like, how do we get past that? How do we create space for each other where everyone has what they need, but we're still looking at the bigger picture? It's a juggling act.
Right. And that's part of that. Everybody has to do it for themselves, and reevaluate the path that got them to where they are. And so it's not about, I don't want anyone else to listen to me and then think that I have all the answers, as much as I want people to listen and to our conversation and feel those sparks of, I never thought that before. And I would rather spark people's imagination than be able to paint a perfect picture of mine. And so that's where the fun comes, the objective. It's not just, okay, everyone, here's the right answer, let's all change now. It's here's something we all need to do, and it's going to be infectious, and it is going to change the way we look at the world. And I'm not talking about eye for an eye and us. I'm talking about this understanding of a greater level of insight that we've never had before. Because we were able to explain everything before with a lack of insight. And so that's where the con men, the lies, how come people can make other people feel good and then hurt them. And it's from a misunderstanding of insight. And the more we gain insight, the more we see the world more clearly. And that's where, when a lot of people have stopped evolving, when they get into those comfort zones, when they find those comfort zones. A lot of people, when they're born in certain situations where they're given everything, rarely do they gain any insight because they don't need to. The people that aren't able to find those boxes throughout high school, they keep growing because they're not there yet. They don't feel like they haven't gotten comfortable yet. And so I benefited from being uncomfortable my whole life, so that I didn't stop and say, okay, this is where I belong. I had to realize that none of those boxes were ever where I belong. They were just what I had to realize was a demonstration of who I didn't want to be.
Yeah, but stepping stones.
Exactly. When you realize, and that's part of it, is I see history as one long trajectory of stepping stones to get to a point where we reevaluate and go the other way. And instead of people looking at time like going left to right, I see time almost as going up to down, and I see us falling. And then what I've realized is we got to stop falling and we got to go the other direction. And by us going more and more into the subjective, more and more into the boxes, smaller and smaller and smaller, we're not expanding our insight. We're not expanding our nature. We're not expanding our consciousness. We're not expanding our relativity. All we're doing is expanding all of our subjective insecurities, because nobody's more secure now than they were. Well, I don't know the word. I can't say that, but if everybody puts their hand up and says, do you think we're on the right trajectory? Are we headed the right direction? And are you fulfilled right now? Are your kids going to be more fulfilled? Do they feel safer than they did? And if everybody puts their hand up and go, no, I don't really feel it. And if we all did it, we would all feel immediately like, wait a minute, we're not alone for feeling this way. And we realize that everybody everywhere feels that way. And then we can all take a deep breath and go, how do we change it? And then all we know is we don't want to do what we've been doing. And by starting at that foundation, whatever we were doing before is wrong, no matter how it made us feel. Let's use our imagination and all of these things that are above the scale to reimagine and reevaluate everything below it. And the more we do, the more we will learn to separate that and gain insight into how we've always been doing. I think we have to stop rationalizing and defending the way we've been living our lives, and start to reevaluate the way we've been living our lives. That is the reflection. I think more people should be doing it while they're in front of a computer or in front of a phone or in the customer service line or wherever it might be. And I think that's what sleeping and dreams and taking yourself out of the equation. And it's
sorry, I had a thought, it floated away, it'll come back. I think that's why it's important to ask more questions and to really, really hone in on that vulnerability, even just with yourself. Because like we all are a certain way because of everything we've experienced up until now. So it's like you either allow that to control your future, or you say, okay, cool, but we're going to stop that now and we're going to move this way because this has not been working up until now. And what I find fascinating is that like everyone wants to pretend that they're fine. Like no one wants to admit that they're not okay. But like the second someone says, I'm not okay, like 10 people will stand up and be like, me too, I'm not okay either. I don't like what's happening. And it's just so much of the human experience, at least from what I've observed, is suffering in silence. And just not having that courage to stand up and say, hey, this really isn't working. Like everyone seems to be on board, but it's not working for me. And it's having that honesty with yourself and just being able to speak up and question things, which is how we change the trajectory.
Yeah, it's that feeling of like momentum. That's why I like those the three words I love to use is momentum, direction, and integrity. Because to me, that is physics. And it also applies to our own trajectories in our lives. And if we're ignoring the momentum and those momentum changes and how it affects our direction, and ultimately what that means for our integrity, if we ignore that, we'll end up in a place where, and everybody else, that's up to everybody on their own, they will end up in a place that they didn't want to be. And they'll say, how did this happen? But if you think of your life in that way, of that momentum, that trajectory, and that direction, and how your integrity feels today compared to then. And all of us have mistakes. We all have the flaws. We've made our choices that had repercussions we could have never imagined, and that we wish we could go back and relive. But understanding that every single person wishes they could go back and relive it is how we can feel less alone. And that's how we can turn all of those negatives, all of my mistakes and all of my things that I used to regret and all of my choices were all based on the pressures I felt of feeling like I wasn't enough, I wasn't good enough. And can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I was pressing buttons on my keyboard. All of those mistakes and all those decisions and all those things that changed my trajectory and my momentum, and it affected my sense of integrity, were all things I did out of insecurity. And so it wasn't about getting better at being insecure. It was about understanding why I was insecure. And that started to change my instincts and saying, I used to do it this way, and now I know why I did it that way. When you're put into that same position, you will never see it the same way again.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where that insight comes along. So I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago, because I might look the same, et cetera, from the outside, but my insight has deepened dramatically, which
Mm-hmm.
helps me relate to people and feel like, what's different about you? You're glowing. People say I glow. It's just, well, I found this comfortable area within myself that I no longer feel insecure. And it's hard to express that to people until they experience it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you reach this level of special relativity to people that said, hey, the world isn't the way we thought it was. And they just try different ways to communicate it and express it in ways that other people can relate. Like, I noticed how they try to say that. I noticed how that, and pyramids and all these ancient cultures are like, here's an expression of an evolution that is hard to describe. It's esoteric, but you're never the same after. And it's just one of those things that all looks like chaos and fragments until it happens to you. And then it all makes sense. And you can relate to not just the people most like you, but the people who and why they're not like you.
Yeah. And I think it's funny that we spend so much energy running from those insecurities, but when you actually just stop and face them head on, that's when they stop having power over you. And that's when you actually can evolve.
Right. And so imagine all those people that made you feel down and put the pressure on you because of their own insecurities, or the people who used your insecurities against you all your life, that pressure you felt, the other people being above you. Once you realize that all of that pressure of your insecurities is actually just in your, like, you have control over that. That's where you start to change your insight, and you realize that everybody else is pushing back on their insecurities as opposed to allowing it to flow through them and for them to understand it and experience it. And so every single person you look at after that who used to intimidate you, you realize that they're not intimidating, they're just scared. Everyone who's mean to you just feels bad about themselves, and they want you to feel bad about themselves. And then you realize that, it doesn't matter the skin color or the age or anything like that. We're just a little fragment of this grander kind of image. And it's impossible not to see the world differently after that. And to be convinced that you have to see the world in a little subjective, through your own subjective eyes, as opposed to an imaginative kind of conceptual space, I think is not using the brain for its full capacity. And once you start to, the positive impulses that your brain creates, there's no drug like it, there's no alcohol, there's no, it's like a constant orgasm that really, it changes the way you see the world. And
it's liberating. It's a liberating feeling.
Right. And that's where, like, it's the opposite of the pursuit I thought I had to take to feel better about myself the whole life. I realized, fuck, I've been doing the wrong thing my whole life to feel better. And that pursuit was never going to make me feel better. No matter how much money I made, how attractive I was, religious, no matter how respected and adored I was by all these scared, insecure, shallow people, it wouldn't have made me feel any better. And it just would have made me a little bit more comfortable the way I used to be. And I don't ever want to be comfortable the way I used to be. And I don't even want to be comfortable the way I am now. I want to become more comfortable in who I want to become. And that's my own principles, my own values, my own measurements, my own insight. So no one else can tell me the way the world is. They can just give me a reflection of the way that they see the world. And then I can see how deep that reflection is depending on the insight that enlightens their point of view or their perspective.
Yeah. And I think like that, actually, I would like for you to talk a little bit about perspective versus point of view, because I do use those terms interchangeably, but you don't use them as the same term.
They're definitely, and like I said, opinion, point of view, perspective, feeling, all of those stuff, all those things kind of meant the same to me. And the more I started to redefine them myself, the more I realized there was a difference between the two. And so when I will never say that two people have a different perspective, because to me that doesn't make sense to me anymore. I see people as having different points of view, and there's no greater value or less value to a point of view. It is merely a reflection of the pressures that they feel in this world. And so that's all I see is every point of view is just pressure, different kinds of pressure. And they're a result of the pressure that they faced. And so where I see a perspective is actually a depth within that point of view. And so the more they can relate to people outside of that point of view, the more depth of insight they have. And so that is their depth of insight. I call that, like, that measurement up is that perspective. So anybody can share. Two people that are very similar and face the same pressures and the same traumas and the same insecurities can relate to each other. But how well can those points of view relate to vastly different points of view? And that's that relativity, where you can connect to all these different points of view that all value the same, and realizing everybody's looking at the world the same way. It's just we're more familiar looking at it through our point of view than others. And so the more we can take our own point of view out of it and see it for pressure in general, you see it more like a swamp of everybody pulling towards their own self-interest, as opposed to everybody stopping and we can all pull the same direction, which means we're all we can all pull this thing to our direction if we all face the same direction. But until we do, I pull it one way, that might pull it away from you. You pulling it one way might pull it away from that 60-year-old man that grounded his instincts and his common sense in something that has awful selfish principles, or people that, you know what I mean? Like and just because 99% of people think that something is a certain way or should be, doesn't mean it's right. And so that's where the bright few that see things differently and have the courage to say, I disagree with convention, are the people that can really make change. And that takes courage. That's why some of those kids are really bright at the beginning, because they don't understand peer pressure yet. And they're just like, this is stupid. You're like, hey, you're wrong, kid. And I'll say, why? Because that was the most insulting thing when I was a child, was I'd ask people why this works. Why does this happen? Why do people do this? And they would say, just because.
Yeah, it's the dismissive answers you give kids, and it's so frustrating. And I was actually just thinking about the fact that, like, when you're a kid, you don't concern yourself with other people's opinions. You wear ridiculous clothes. Like, you want to dress up like a superhero. You want to wear how you're feeling. And you then go through this filter of people making fun of the way you dress, or telling you need to be a certain way, you need to present a certain way. And like, you lose that self-confidence, that esteem of, like, I'm speaking for myself, maybe some people don't, and they like grow up to be eccentric weirdos. And I love that. But I, like, for myself, know that I lost that eccentricity because of bullies. And only as an adult am I remembering, oh yeah, I used to be like a really creative, weird kid. Like, what happened to that? Let's bring that back.
Right. Exactly. And that's kind of the experience I started going through too, when I started to reevaluate who I am and why. And part of that, those eccentricities, the things that I would suppress because other people might not understand it. And the more I did that, the less impulse I had to produce that. And so I would numb the sensation of creating these positive, eccentric, esoteric impulses because other people couldn't understand. They think I'm crazy, but realizing that was me reevaluating how I felt in that moment, or reevaluating like, hey, this is what I think and see and feel. Well, if I'm the only one that does that and everyone else makes fun of me for it, then I don't want to feel and think and see that way. And it just kind of grounded my imagination in these shallow pursuits of money and of sex and of applause and all of these things that, like, I think later on, I think all these people I used to look up to, the athletes and the musicians and the movie stars, how many of them came out by saying that they are so depressed, and they are like the substance abuse and the mental health issues and the suicide. They reached all these things that I thought were going to be the answer for all of my problems. And I realized all they are just different problems, but those are problems that can be sold to you, as opposed to, and that's why the publicity and everything, hide how sad everybody is, because if everybody tells how sad they are, then everybody's going to realize that it's all bullshit. And so that's where the internet and all this stuff is changing how we see the world, because all those sports heroes, when I was young, I didn't know what happened to them after they retired, right? You wouldn't hear about them. They go sign autographs and stuff, and everybody say how amazing they were. They've got it made. You don't realize what they go through after, and this lack of objective in their lives. And now they're trapped in this identity of being this once bright, young superstar. And it doesn't matter how many accomplishments they made in those sports. They end up in gambling, they end up in this and that. And it's false. And I wish more athletes told me when I was younger, this is all bullshit and we're just as unhappy, or anything. I wish all those athletes told me when I was a kid that they were more unhappy than I was as a kid. Because if I knew that, I wouldn't have chased their same trajectory. But they told me, do this, do that, and you're going to be as good as I am and as happy, kid. Well, fuck, that's what I want to do when I grow up, because I don't want to feel like I do now. I want to feel the way they feel. And what happened was I was actually happier back then than they were then. So it's just
superficial dopamine.
Right. And all of my influence were telling me, this is what you have to do to be contribute to society, and to take care of yourself and be responsible and for people to respect. These are the things that matter in this life, Matt. Now start fucking adding value to that. And I realized that to do that, I had to suppress everything that made me special. But the more I reevaluated, the more I can combine all of them into who I can become. And that's where that self-discovery comes in. And that insight isn't something that we can, inject into someone. Insight is something that people have to expand themselves and want to. And there is no insight without understanding why. And there is no insight without the right intentions and the right impulses. And if your impulse is to be selfish, you will never gain insight. You will only gain more subjective tunnel vision.
So if I was to use this measuring system, this scale that you've designed, to discover my own insight, like how would you do it? Like, how would you map yourself out onto this scale?
Okay, so what I would do is I would start writing my story, go through the things, my timeline of how I got to today. And so the situation of your birth, right? So this was where I was born. This is where it's whether you're an only child, they're child of 3, child of 7, oldest, youngest, 3 boys, 2 girls, whatever the case may be. That's pressure. And understanding that no matter which situation it is, that's all anyone ever knows is their own pressure that they face for the most part. And so, okay, and then you got the family situation. Were you from money, not from money? A long tradition in that area, immigration, et cetera, right? Cultural, all these things push you into a certain mindset and a certain trajectory. And as you go through your life, you keep putting these things and all your accomplishments, and you map out your life. you start to realize that all of those things that you chased and that made you feel good were all in your own best self-interest. And even if most people say, well, no, I didn't do it for myself, I did it to make my parents proud, did whatever, you're still doing it to make them proud of you. And so most of those things you can put into that bottom scale. And then you start to realize that the things that truly matter, and sometimes people can arrive to it before their like epiphany of, oh, I've been wrong, or they can use that to create the epiphany that says I've been wrong. Because the more that you see that the categories above are things that you didn't value, that people didn't value and didn't focus on in our environment, we were pressured to ignore those things. Mm-hmm. And so by starting to reevaluate those things above, you start to realize that, so most people tell me about their lives. They'll tell me everything in the bottom. They don't tell me anything in the top scale. They tell me everything in the bottom. This is who I am. And I think, ooh, okay, that's some pretty subjective, shallow shit, right? Where's the depth in who you are? It's not the accomplishments you did, it's what those accomplishments mean and the insight gained through those accomplishments. And so loss is often more valuable than triumph. And it's because of the insight gained through it. And so people that are just used to winning never actually gain any insight into what it means to win. And then winning gets shallow. But the people who lost, who gain the insight it takes to win, are the ones that are most influential, that can say, hey, this is what I learned, not this is who I am. I don't care who people are. I care what they learned and how they change. How have you changed in the last 5 years? That interests me. Not this is who I am and what I've done. Who are you going to be tomorrow? You know, who are we going to be in 10 years? That interests me because that takes imagination and consideration, and et cetera, et cetera. And I just see like the most insulting thing to me, I believe, is someone saying, hey, you haven't changed a bit. Like, fuck, I hope I have, because I feel like I have. I feel like I've gained so much insight since the last time you've seen me, but realizing that is superficial and there's no value in it to me. There's no value in how attractive I am, only how magnetic and energetic I can be. And it all comes from positive impulses and from a place of being vulnerable and feeling secure in my vulnerability. There is no greater superpower than being vulnerable and secure at the same time. And that takes insight.
True. That's true. That takes insight and it takes courage. And I think what we're talking about is waking people up so that they stop living their lives on autopilot and like really thinking about like, well, why? Like it's the why of it. Like, why am I doing this? Why did I pick this career? Why did I pick this partner? Why is this how I spend my free time? And just making people question things, which I don't think enough of us do. I mean, like, I know we do, because like thinking is one of my favorite hobbies, and probably like I do it too much, but it's like it's getting people to question like, why am I on this trajectory? Like, who am I doing it for? Because a lot of times like people are just doing what they think they're supposed to, not what they want to be doing. Everyone's chasing happiness and neglecting fulfillment.
Yeah. And that's why I talk about the scale as in like, this is what worked for me. It's really about how every single person chooses to reevaluate themselves in the world. And if we always choose to reevaluate the world and ourselves in the same way to make us feel better, we're never going to reevaluate it in a way to make us better, because those are two different things. And that's why I just want to communicate. This is how I learned to reframe the way I see the world and reframe the way I value and choose and craft my own instincts and my own impulses. And the more I do, the more I feel it in every aspect of my life. And so saying that whether anyone else understands it or not, or can relate to it or not, this is my insight. And nobody can judge me on that. And if they do, I just think it's a lack of insight on their part. And so the greater the insight, the more we can relate to each other. And that in itself is a way to reevaluate who we are and can be. And it's one of those things, like they say, once you see it, you can never unsee it. Well, once you see behind the curtain and you realize it's not what they told you it was, they can't close the curtain and tell you that it's that anymore, right? It's the facade. Once you see behind the facade, you realize there's depth, or there
Yeah.
could be depth where there isn't. And often they don't want there to be depth there because they're already so far down this way that if we show them how to reevaluate, everything they valued is gone. It's that apocalypse, that, you know, everything, you know, that all those analogies of just to make people fear change is, you know, part of that self-interest that has to be reevaluated. And everything that, every boundary and hurdle and mountain that and wall that is placed in front of this kind of objective is just something that further justifies how great it is and how substantial and evolutionary it could be. And it's just reframing the conversation and seeing how people get scared when you do.
Yeah. Reframing the conversation, but also like reframing what we consider success, because success has been presented to us from a very superficial standpoint. Whereas when you think about personal success, what does that mean? In my opinion, that means evolution. So like there really is no finish line. Like there is just an infinite staircase where you just keep evolving and keep learning more about yourself and becoming a more authentic version of you. At least that's my definition of success. And that's where my core values come in, is that striving towards authenticity. But yeah, sorry, where was I going with that? Where you're saying like reframing the conversation and scaring people with change, because it's moving into the unknown. And it's like, but you have to get out of that comfort space. Otherwise you stagnate.
Right. And I think each person, it is unknown until it's not. And it's not up to anyone else to decide that as much as it's up to the individual. And for me, exactly. It was unknown until I decided that I want to see the world differently. And then I started to. And then it is no longer unknown anymore. There is a depth that other people see as dark and scary, that I see as beautiful, and we can fill with so much vulnerability and so much humanity in that space where there was none. And it's really like a way to look at it too, with that measurement. I like to think of mankind as the bottom and humanity as the top. And I see so much defense of mankind that we start to lose what our humanity within it. And there is no mankind without humanity, but there would be a beautiful level of humanity without mankind, at least from a reimagination, reinvention standpoint.
Well said. I like that.
How's that for an end cap on that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like that's perfect. I nothing to add on that. That's beautifully said.
Perfect. Well, till next time, I guess.
Yeah.
Stay tuned. Bye.
Bye.
We were born before the wind, also younger than the sun. Yeah, the bonnie boat was one as we sail into the mystic. Oh, I can now hear the sailors cry, smell the sea and feel the sky. Let your soul and spirit fly